Good evening, everybody. I'm Don Gordon. I'm the Executive Director of the Riley Institute at Furman. And on behalf of the Riley Institute and the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, welcome to tonight's very special program. We're so glad to have all 961 of you here with us tonight. Yeah, we counted you from the balcony. For the final session of a three-part series, StraightTalk, Nationalist Fervor on the Rise. This evening is part of a deeper look at the rising trends of nationalism in the United States and beyond. And one of the goals of the Riley Institute is to bring people together around issues of great importance in order to deepen and broaden understanding of these issues. We're looking forward to a very fascinating and robust discussion this evening as we shift focus to a very specific form of nationalism, white nationalism. I want to give a special welcome to our speakers, Derek Black and Sara McCammon. Derek and Sara, we really appreciate your being with us this evening. And folks, I would be remiss if I did not tell you that this year is the 20th anniversary of the Riley Institute. Come on, keep on clapping. I love that. So, we're really proud of this, as you might imagine. We began in 1999. We had an idea of what we could accomplish. And now, 20 years later, we have become an integral part of Furman University. In the fall of 2019, the Riley Institute has 18-person staff who are part of 3 centers of impact within the Riley Institute. Our Center for Diversity Strategies, our Center for Education Policy and Leadership, and the center of which this program is part, our Center for Critical Issues. The Riley Institute focuses on leadership and knowledge, and we do a lot. For Furman students, programs such as this one that bring dignitaries and experts and academicians and practitioners from around the world who offer a real-world focus to complex issues. But we do much more than that for students, including our Advantaged Scholars Program. The Riley Institute Advanced Team, you've seen many of them here tonight, making sure things go smoothly. Our APEC program, which takes students around the world looking at global political and economic issues, like Papua New Guinea and Vietnam are the latest 2 places. And of course, our internships and research opportunities with us here and across the country. And for our state of South Carolina, we bring together a focus on leveraging diversity to bring a much larger portion of South Carolinians into the social and economic mainstream of our state. And then our Wilkins Excellence in Legislative and Civic Leadership program celebrates leaders in South Carolina's legislature and civic leadership areas who work across the aisles to make South Carolina a better state for all of its people. And we work to make sure that public education is more effective for the students in our state and across the country. In all, the Riley Institute operates 40 programs across the state of South Carolina and nationally. All of this is in the name of our principal leader, former governor of South Carolina and U.S. Secretary of Education, Dick Riley. So on October 3rd, mark that down, Secretary Riley will be celebrated along with our 20th anniversary. We're going to have a big party, an event here in our Auditorium. It's going to be very special. Go look on our website and look what happens on October the 3rd and be there or be square. Now I'd like to turn our program over to my colleague, Dr. Danielle Vinson of the Department of Politics and International Relations. Danielle sets the gold standard for teaching and advising and is a remarkable facilitator. Please welcome Dr. Danielle Vinson.
Thank you, Don, and good evening to all of you. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to mention 3 things. First, please check your cell phone. Be sure it is on silent. If you don't, I'm asking your neighbor to stare at you when it goes off in a very stern, disapproving way. Second, we invite you to submit your questions for our speakers via text message to the number on the screen. While you have your cell phone out before you put it up, you may take a picture of the screen. But also remember the number is printed on your program. If you submit a question, please be brief and include your name. During the last 15 minutes of the program, 2 members of the Riley Institute Advanced Team will read the questions that we get from our audience. Third, there are copies of Eli Saslow's book, Rising Out of Hatred, The Awakening of a Former White Nationalist, for sale in the lobby. It's an excellent book and a quick read, and I encourage you to pick up a copy before you leave if you haven't already done so. Tonight we're here for our third night of Straight Talk, titled Blood and Soil When Nationalist Fervor is Racism. Last week we talked about changing demographics, white identity, and the politics of identity. We heard 3 varied perspectives on how these trends and reactions are driving nationalist fervor in the US and in Europe. Tonight we're going to look at a specific type of nationalism, white nationalism. We're going to hear about this movement and its ideology from someone who was not only a part of it, but was expected to be the leader who would carry the movement into the future. Derek Black is currently doing dissertation research in Washington, D.C., and interning at the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center at American University. His life has taken a very different course than anyone would have predicted when he left home for New College in Sarasota, Florida. Until that time, Derek's godfather and mentor, former KKK Grand Wizard David Duke, referred to Derek as the leading light of the white nationalist movement. Throughout Derek's childhood and adolescence, he was immersed in the culture of white supremacy. In 1995, Derek's father, who also led the KKK for nearly a decade, started the first white supremacist website, stormfront.org, and at the age of 12, Derek created a kids' version of the site. As a teenager, Derek co-hosted a white pride radio show along with his dad, and even ran for and won public office by espousing white nationalist beliefs. He firmly believed everything his family and friends had taught him, that they must secure the existence of the white race and a future for their children. Then he went to college. Here tonight to tell us the story of his transformation is Derek Black himself. Derek, we thank you for being here with us this evening and for your willingness to share your story. Please join me in welcoming Derek Black.
Thanks to the Riley Institute for having me and for the Furman community broadly. In 2001, a USA Today article began with this sentence about me. 12-year-old Derek Black won first place this year in a local science fair, and he carries around an encyclopedic knowledge of frogs, snakes, fish, and the web. With red hair past his shoulders and slightly crooked front teeth, he looks like the typical tech-savvy preteen that he is, yet the thing that makes his father proudest is that Derek runs a website for kids promoting white supremacy and racial hate. The year that I was born, 1989, was also the year that David Duke won his race for Louisiana State Legislature, despite having led the Ku Klux Klan just a decade prior and continuing to espouse white supremacist positions. My dad, Don Black, was managing the campaign's digital operations in their database, and he was working on the campaign to support his friend of many decades. When David had stepped down from leading the Klan, he had passed the baton to my father. In the intervening years over the 1980s, my dad had run the Klan, stepped down from the Klan, and served a 2-year prison sentence for his effort to arm and invade the island of Dominica. After his release, he had reconnected with my mother, who was David's ex-wife, and I was born. In February of 1989, he was driving back overnight to return to South Florida while my mother was in labor. My birth prevented him from being present for the unlikely victory that David Duke experienced a few weeks later. In that campaign, they had received formal condemnations from Ronald Reagan, from then President George W. Bush, and from the Republican Party Chairman Lee Atwater. The next year, David ran for U.S. Senate unsuccessfully. The year after that, he ran for Louisiana governor, and he also lost. In those campaigns, however, he won 55% and 60% respectively of the statewide white vote. He didn't use explicit racial language, he never used racial epithets, and he never explicitly advocated anything bad happening to communities of color. He campaigned against higher taxes, against against big government, against free trade because he said it hurt workers, and he advocated sending troops to seal the border with Mexico. Despite David's one-time success, his later campaigns came unsettlingly close to victory, but he never got there. My dad took the computer bulletin board that he'd set up to facilitate communications on the campaign, and he expanded it into a white nationalist dial-up bulletin board that attracted people from all branches of the white nationalist movement. When the web came online shortly after, he created the first white nationalist website and white nationalist community online. He popularized the term white nationalist itself. After the Oklahoma City bombing by Timothy McVeigh in '95, which remained the most deadly terrorist attack in US history until September 11th, the national media began covering fringe movements like white nationalism and the move to technology that they were embracing. With no electoral successes, all the focus turned towards building the movement, gaining membership, finding recruits, and getting donations. I grew up attending white nationalist conferences across the US. When I was 8 or 9, I told my dad I wanted to start participating when journalists would come to his office to do interviews. Major nightly TV shows would come over and spend the entire day setting up the lighting, and we'd have to run an extension cord from another part of the house to keep their equipment from blowing out the fuses on our old electrical system. They'd record for hours, and then the program would be released, and we'd hope they included a few good quotes from us because we wanted to get people to come to the website. When I was 17, I started an internet radio network on Stormfront. I recruited volunteers, and we eventually built up to live programming for 8 hours a day. And when I'd programmed their shows to repeat on the weekends, I started a show that was old-timey country music and half white nationalist interpretations of the news. In 2008, when I was 19, I filed for a spot on the local ballot to fill an executive committee seat for the Palm Beach County Republican Party. I enlisted my family and friends as volunteers, and I knocked on the doors of nearly every registered Republican within several miles of my house. And I won that race espousing white nationalist talking points without identifying exactly what my family was a part of, with 60% of the vote. Once it became widely known what my background was, it escalated into a national media scandal. The party leaders condemned me. David Duke came to town to defend me. I received death threats, but I also got local praise from people I met wherever I was out. There was a period where I couldn't go and pay for my order at Dunkin' Donuts because somebody in line would walk up to the register and say, no, Derek, you're doing the good work. You don't have to pay for this. Everyone who came up to me like that on the street had positive affirmation. That's the context in which I spent my childhood up until college. I want to take a moment for a visual break of just what that looked like with a few photos. I grew up in Palm Beach County. This is a photo from the 2000 election. My dad marching with the Populist Party and I on the left, trying to campaign for Governor Bush to win the candidacy in front of the Supervisor of Elections office with a Confederate flag and a Celtic cross flag, a symbol of white nationalism. Next one. We would attend conferences throughout the South. This is me when I was, I think, 8 or 9 years old with who was then Governor of Mississippi, Kirk Fordice, who attended these conferences and spoke before us. Next one, please. The radio show that I hosted as a teenager and the engagement with the community that my dad and I tried to facilitate before I went to college. Interviews with the New York Times after I had won this local election when David Duke came into town to support me. Confronting the Republican Party, this room filled with people who were absolutely outraged that I would bring in this white supremacist ideology into their committee. Next. And then finally, this is where I would like to take this talk by the end of it. This is a photo of myself on the right. On the far left is Matthew Stevenson. In the middle left is Allison Gornick, and then another friend who attended these Shabbat dinners. This is a photo that we took after college, but this is a representation of the sort of community that I experienced and that led to a couple of years of a very traumatic and dramatic experience that ultimately led me to stand here today. Could go back to the background, please. By the summer of 2013, several years after that campaign and after I had experienced college, I was house sitting for two of my medieval history professors. They were traveling. I'd graduated about a month earlier and I was interning at an art museum. I was living in Sarasota, where the college I had attended, New College, was. I was trying to defend my undergraduate thesis and try to get it published. I had a journal, and it was in the same summer that I wrote a letter condemning white nationalism. And I'd like to tell you how I got there. And in order to do that, I think it's important to take a quote from that letter that explains what white nationalism is and what it believes. In that letter, I defined the white nationalist movement as: white nationalism supports the premise that multiculturalism is a failure and that politicians who are somehow trapped in this multicultural status quo are oppressing white people in a country that they think should be all white. They typically blame the West's movement towards inclusion on a conspiracy that states Jewish people are organized to promote equality, which they believe hurts white people. White nationalists cite misleading or false black-on-white crime statistics and the increasing prevalence of non-white cultures and values in Western society, as well as the growing number of legal protections and employment opportunities that they believe a quote-unquote minority status affords. On the other hand, white nationalists consider white people in the US to be ostensibly the victims of an ongoing genocide brought about by immigration and intermarriage, and they feel that when they try to speak up about it, they're subjected to a double standard. When they attempt to credit some victory to how excellent white people are, they're called racists, and they believe that's unfair. Thus, they believe their own political leaders are victimizing white people, and the system has turned its weapons against white identity. Therefore, they think that whites have to oppose resistance to racism in order to guarantee the future of white people as an identity group. Like, that is a definition that I would have ascribed to and that I think most white nationalists today would. In 2010, however, I was still committed. I was committed to that ideology. And in that year, I transferred to a 4-year liberal arts college called New College of Florida. It was an obvious choice for me because I could only afford Florida's low in-state tuition, and New College was the public liberal arts honors college of the state, and it had a strong medieval studies program. In a lot of ways, it was very mundane. During the first semester, I went totally unrecognized. And I made friends who were strong social justice activists. I made friends from every racial, ethnic, and religious group. And I thought that that did not particularly challenge my worldview because individuals were one thing, but the world and everyone in it was a whole nother story. I'd play my guitar on my balcony. People in my dorm would come and sing songs, and I'd share notes from my class on like Norman history with an Orthodox Jewish friend, Matthew, who lived across from me. Each morning, however, I'd call into my white nationalist AM radio show that my dad had taken up hosting, and we would talk. I knew it was only a matter of time before that world and this world at college collided, and it was very clear to me that unlike every other situation I had been in, this one would not be tolerant. This would not be a situation where people would say, I understand that you're involved in white nationalism and I really hate that, but let's do something else. Second semester, I studied abroad in Europe, and during that semester, my reputation for my activism on Stormfront and for my political campaign and my radio show and all the things I had done caught up with me, and it resulted in a huge email thread on the student forum. It had over 1,000 responses in a few days, and it was the largest thing that had ever been discussed on the forum up until that point. When I came back, having been granted the right to stay off campus by the administration at the very last minute, my very presence on campus was a scandal. I continued taking classes, and the administration never commented on it in any way. My presence on campus, although I never mentioned it publicly or did any activism on campus, along with several other events on campus unrelated to me, resulted in a student-led teach-in that canceled all classes. They had to advocate to the faculty and staff that white nationalism was one thing. There was an actual white nationalist on their campus, but people were experiencing racism, anti-Semitism, even in this liberal bastion, and that denying it was causing more harm to them. There was pushback from the administration, but they did it. They were able to get all classes canceled and have a teach-in discussion where people felt comfortable talking about their experiences at New College. And I did not feel comfortable going there, and I did not. I stood on the outside and I sort of watched. I'd intended for my college degree to help me become a better writer, a speaker, an arguer, and to become better at reasoning. I believe that white nationalism was factually correct, even if the people in this campus and in a wider liberal world didn't really like its conclusions. I thought they were just denying the facts. For me, this meant the idea that race was real and that it required immigration and policy to be based on race, and that people would be and were happiest in some sort of monoracial countries. I thought this was benign. I thought at worst it was an argument worth having, even if it turned out to be wrong, but I just knew that these theories about race were correct because I'd spent years reading crime statistics from white nationalist journals that show crime was higher per capita among black people than whites, that IQ scores around the world were highest for East Asians, then for whites, and on in this hierarchy. I didn't believe that the incarceration of millions of black people could be caused by a biased white supremacist system because I was convinced that racism was a myth that was no longer relevant. What changed my mind were two things: trying to be a good historian, as I was a history major, who followed evidence where it led, and being willing to explain my beliefs to a friend who I made at New College at those Shabbat dinners, Allison Gornick, who attended the dinners that Matthew had invited me to, and who I'd gotten to know before my identity became public. At first, Allison stopped attending those dinners whenever I showed up and avoided even being in the room when I was there. She was very firm that the values of the campus that she wanted to affirm were those that said that the threatened parts of our community, the threatened people who white nationalism said didn't belong, had to be made to feel comfortable, and that it was a bad idea to try to spend your time making the white nationalists in the room feel comfortable. And so for days, weeks, months, she didn't speak to me, she didn't come to these dinners, and she worked with aspects of the community that I have since come to see as very courageous. This condemnation was ultimately extremely important to me. And it was the reason that I reached out to her and we first started talking. New College was a small place and we got to know each other a bit. One day we ended up in a group of students who were going out into the bay on campus on another student's sailboat. Allison was from Ohio, I was from Florida, and she said everyone she had asked the teacher how to sail had flaked on her. So I offered, I said, I'll teach you how to sail. She took me up on the offer. And after asking all of her friends whether it was okay to do this with me, and they all responded, "Are you insane? But I guess he's fine," we went out sailing. Over the next 2 years, we started to talk about what I believed. And I listened when she came back with better research that showed just why race made no sense as a biological category or a position to create immigration and social policies. I don't have the couple years that it took me, but in brief, those arguments and the counterarguments are these. For instance, I eventually had to accept that there is robust research demonstrating that socioeconomic status, access to resources and education are correlated with crime rates, not race. The same IQ test cannot be universalized around the world, as white nationalists try to claim. IQ tests are culturally normed, and they're not magic assessments of brain activity. They too are related to access and economics. Race cannot be biologically defined, which is a problem that even the white nationalist community runs into whenever it tries to define who can become members of organizations. I remember a thread in the moderators forum on Stormfront once that never became public where they discussed how can we define race? How can we define whiteness? Because only a white person can become a member. And the only distinction that they could actually come up with was if you identify as white and you call yourself white and other people who see you tend to think you're white, then I guess that's what white means. And thinking back on being 14 and watching the leaders of the white nationalist movement realize that they couldn't define white, and yet their whole worldview was based in it, should have sent more red flags. Finally, most of all, our society is inarguably oppressive, and the system is biased towards white people. In a study that's been replicated many times, identical resumes are much more likely to be given a callback when the applicant has a white name rather than a typically black name. A black child raised in a two-parent family in an upper middle class home is likely to end up with the same lifetime income as a white person who was raised in a single-parent home with half the income. African Americans charged with the same crime are given longer sentences, even when the person giving the sentence is made aware of the disparity and asked to try to prevent it. And yet, millions of white Americans, when polled, will say that discrimination in America is now greater against white people than it is against minorities, which is factually untrue. Belief in this myth threatens to grow the white nationalist movement or similar white supremacist ideologies. In my history classes, I came to realize that race, at least in the modern conception of color that's supposed to predict intelligence and society building and creativity, was only invented a few centuries ago. And it corresponded with colonialism. When I was no longer moored on my need to bolster white nationalism, and when I was away from members of the movement, it became clear that the evidence demonstrated that European society, even if you could find something that looks like a European society before a few centuries ago, was certainly not more advanced than Islamic culture next door or of Chinese culture in other periods. During the medieval periods that I studied, Baghdad was the largest city in the world, and my European sources openly marveled at it. Students wanting an advanced education went to Muslim-dominated Al-Andalus in Iberia, and they recognized that Islamic science was far advanced from their own. If race was a biological predictor of society building, how did that make sense? No one aspect of those experiences in history research or those long, emotional, and tense conversations that I had in private with Allison led me to abandon the beliefs that my family had taught and which I had absorbed my entire life. If there's a general lesson to take from my experience, I think it's that it took an environment away from the people who might police whether I was remaining orthodox in all my beliefs. It required that I bring a conviction that I wanted to be right, not because it's what I wanted to believe, but because those beliefs were what the facts demonstrated through history and science. It required that I experience a community of smart people who I respected and cared about personally, who were firm that what I was advocating was not only wrong, but socially corrosive and inhumane. And it required a friend who was somehow able to be a friend while never giving me a pass to believe or espouse the things that she knew were wrong. And yet, that was not a guarantee that my education would end with me being convinced that white nationalism was destructive and renouncing it. Lots of white nationalists have college degrees. Both of my parents do. In fact, they and many other white nationalists became white nationalists for the first time while they were in college. I very well could have come out of that experience with a story to tell movement leaders about intolerant liberals and with a much better sense of what social justice arguments consisted of so I could mock them. Aside from the arguments, I think that I, like many college students, valued community and I cared about those around me. And my community at that time in college made the correct decision to prioritize the people who felt unsafe on campus because of me, rather than trying to make me feel comfortable. They said explicitly that they wanted people of color on campus to feel safe. They staged protests on campus. They made it clear I was unwelcome at events, and they made it clear that I was responsible for people feeling unsafe, and that wasn't a misunderstanding. On my end, at the time, I felt that that was unfair, because I'd only ever used words and I never tried to intimidate or make anyone feel unsafe or threaten them. But at that point, I hadn't connected the direct line between my words and others' actions. And I had not realized that the impact is more important than the intention. It's an odd thing to grow up in white nationalism, but I didn't recognize what that meant until I was outside of it. Some of you might have had this experience of being raised in maybe a very specific religious tradition, and you didn't realize until after you were outside of it that many of its assumptions are funny. I think that my experiences growing up are probably closer to that, even though my parents were absolutely devout atheists. And yet, being in a marginalized group of ideologues can also produce some observations about the majority society. I now regularly have to watch political speeches, even by supposedly normal politicians, that advocate extreme immigration restriction or abolishing affirmative action, things that mirror the white nationalist positions that I always thought would be hard to get widespread acceptance for. To conclude this, I'd like to leave you with a couple of thoughts. As you move through the world, you will encounter people who believe in white nationalism. You will encounter people who believe in milder forms of beliefs that white nationalists want to whip up into a much more extreme form of racist ideas. There's nothing to indicate these people. They come from every class. They live in every profession. They have degrees. They don't have degrees. They are normal people. Their beliefs are caustic. You can choose which pathway that you go on, engaging in logical arguments, finding a friend, meeting somebody in good faith when they meet you in good faith, or you can protest. You can find ways to attack the larger system. You can assert your values. You can speak to the community that you're a part of and say that if what we are doing causes harm to others, we cannot do it, and that we don't accept other people doing that. The only thing that you can't do is what no one on that campus did, and that is nothing, because silence is the only wrong choice when faced with a question of what our values and what our morals have to be. Thank you.
Derek, thank you for sharing that very powerful story of your own changes in viewpoint. In just a few minutes, we're going to ask Sara McCammon of NPR to join us on stage, but first I want to have a little bit of a conversation with you about some of what we've just heard and a few other things moving us forward in this discussion. You just pointed out that people need to act, right? And you mentioned it takes courage, that it took courage for Allison to not give you a pass and to sort of condemn. Right. How do people figure out when is that time? Because as I'm someone who grew up in South Carolina, I have heard all of the conversations about it's just our heritage. We just want to remember our heritage and take pride in our heritage. At what point do you decide that it's gone beyond just fondly remembering a history of your family to being white nationalism? What's the step there?
I think it's important to think about how white nationalists view that same equation. I think it's almost a shorthand for thinking about how we live our lives, because white nationalists, there's too many, but they're not the majority. They're a tiny fraction of people in this country, people who believe in this ideology, but they view the world as varying degrees of agreement with them. And they look at Confederate monuments and the Confederate flag not as symbols of Southern heritage. There are plenty of people who have Confederate ancestors and they feel that sort of ancestry, but when they're organizing a march or when they're trying to create some sort of political event, they look at Confederate monuments as a way to embrace white supremacy. Like, that's how they see it. They see that society looks at these monuments and the flag, and they see that it is condemned as white supremacy, but they can find lots of people who are willing to stand up, and whether they are thinking something completely different about it, the white nationalists will create the rally and embrace the white part of it. They don't show up saying it's for Southern pride, they show up saying it's for white pride. And if we are living our lives and choosing what we're going to do, it's not innocuous to find yourself at the same rally as a white nationalist. And I think that there's actually a way of thinking about the world that if the world that the white nationalist wants to see is being embraced by our own cause, we have to really question what is the impact that we are creating by doing that. And I don't mean that to be glib. I think it's actually something that's very serious to think about.
You've mentioned the impact of white nationalism, and there are two different directions I want to go with this. First of all, we have seen people reacting out of white nationalism who were involved in mass shootings. We had one in South Carolina, in Charleston, that took the lives of 9 people. And the shooter mentioned that he had posted manifesto on Stormfront, and the white website white nationalist website created by your father. Just last month, we had another one who killed 22 people in El Paso, Texas, who posted anti-immigrant sentiments on a white nationalist site. How do your father, how do others who have been or are in the white nationalist movement react to things like that, that they see as examples of white nationalism taken to its extreme?
Right. My family was always able to justify that they were not responsible, because on Stormfront he could say that any talk of anything illegal was banned or any advocacy for violence was banned. And so my dad's offhand statement whenever this happened was, oh, he went to Stormfront. Well, he also went to Google. What is the connection? That there's no responsibility if people go out and commit these crimes believing every single thing that he had advocated, that people are invaders, that there are people who don't belong, that you can identify the enemy. This ideology runs through all of these attacks, and yet people like my family can tell themselves, they can condemn it, they can genuinely say they hate this violence, that it's not helpful to them, that it's counterproductive, they don't want people to do it, and yet not accept any of the moral responsibility for promoting and helping to spread an ideology that inspired it. And I think that people in that position need to, if they genuinely are opposed to something so evil, they need to be a bit more honest with themselves about the connections between that.
It's easy to see the impact of white nationalism and white supremacy on minorities and religious groups and things like that. Does it have an effect? Do the policies of white supremacy have an effect on whites?
Yeah, I actually believe so. And maybe that sounds counterintuitive, because on its face, it seems, whether you're willing to discuss what people say when they say like white privilege or white domination, it seems like there are obvious like economic benefits. There's an enormous wealth gap between white families and black families. For every dollar that a white person has in America, an African American will have 10 cents. And so it seems very straightforward that this history of whiteness as a dominating group is all to the benefit. But I'm currently working on a project with the Anti-Racist Center about how this has negatively affected white people too. There's an economic argument. GDP by 2028, we will have lost $1 trillion in GDP in the United States because of the racial wealth gap. Had there not been this history of oppression, had black families not been deprived of so much wealth, the production in America by 2028 would be $1 trillion more than it is, which is something that we would all experience. There are racial policies throughout the 20th century and before that have led to bad health outcomes for white people, not just in the South, but throughout the country. There is, I think, a very good moral argument that living in a society that is not unequal by accident, but unequal by historical design is not good. It's not a society that we want to live in. And I think it's important to think about this as not something that takes away from any white family. It's something that makes all of us healthier to try to figure out ways that we can overcome inequalities that have been designed, that have been put into place by not us, by people who came before us that we are not responsible for, but we are responsible if we don't try to do something to right the injustice. And I think there's a very good moral and also economic and health and on policy argument that it is not just better for people of color, it's better for white people, it's better for everyone if we have a just society.
Would someone espousing white nationalist views be open to that kind of argument?
I don't think so, because they don't think about it. They will tell you all the time that they are very rational, that everything is based in evidence, but in reality, it is a community that they're tied to. It's an identity, it is a sense that I'm better than other people, and they don't want to give that up. It's not like you could say, but we'd have a higher GDP if you just didn't embrace this so much, because it's a commitment to the idea that I'm white, and that means that other people are a threat to me. And that's the fundamental belief that you have to challenge. That you have to challenge what community they see as being a part of, and who they see as not them, and who they see as a threat. And you have to target that and make people think about that before you can convince them with any kind of facts. That's one of the points that I always want to make, is that my arguments in college were on facts, but I wasn't willing to have those arguments on facts until I was in a community that made me want to. People could tell me this stuff for years, but I wasn't willing to listen until I was in a community that I wanted to hear it.
Is there a difference between white nationalism and white supremacy?
They definitely will say there is. My dad adopted the term white nationalism because he wanted to argue that he didn't want a society like apartheid, where some people were under, where people of color were under and white people were over. He wanted a society where there was nobody but white people. And if you stop and ponder that for a second, the level of government power, the level of violence that you would have to employ to create this sort of world, even if you could define what is white, the end goals would be worse than Nazi Germany. And so they may use this term to try to say, it doesn't matter if we think we're better than other people because we want everybody to just live happily in other nations. There is no way that you could ever possibly advocate that other than by advancing white supremacy.
Where's the white nationalist movement today? Is it growing? Is it healthy? Who's leading it?
Right. In some ways, it is at a low point for organizations. I think Charlottesville was actually quite bad for organized membership and donations. In the aftermath of Charlottesville, there's been legal challenges. People have had great difficulty getting donations. They've been kicked off their server hosts. There's been a social backlash to the white nationalist movement because of Charlottesville that I think in some ways has made it a weak point in terms of actual organizations. But in other ways, I think it's quite strong. If you count it based on how many people are online engaging, it's hard to exactly say what the numbers are, but all estimates seem to say there's more people now engaging with this ideology and this worldview than you've ever had before, that there's more people who are easily able to get to it online than ever were before, and that there's a climate where more people are interested in it than ever before.
That raises an interesting question. How important is social media and the internet for the white nationalist movement?
I think it's critical. There's a longer term, like the website that my dad created was before social media. It was a community and a forum, and I think that's still important for that ideology, to have its own websites where only they're there. And I think that's probably the ultimate goal, is to get people onto white nationalist sites. But social media for years, and I think I would also include Google as a search as social media in this, has been essential in driving traffic to those websites. I don't think there is any entity in the world that has driven more people to white nationalist publications than Google. And it's just something to think about, that if the worldview that white nationalists offer is fills any sort of gap with some person who's showing up with a more mild belief and then they escalate and then some number of them commit crimes or just live in a world that didn't have to be that way. You have to wonder, like, what have we done that we've spread that?
We're going to ask Sara to come join us in just a moment. I want to ask one more question of you that will segue into some things we want to talk to her about. And that is, you mentioned that the target audience for white nationalists are often people who start a sentence with, "I'm not racist, but." Can you talk a little bit more about that? Why target those folks?
Right. That's a line that my dad always used, that these attacks that white nationalists would perpetrate, he said, like, these are not the people we want. We don't want the weirdos. We don't want the crazy people. There is a large group of normal, average, moderate-seeming people who were the Duke voters, who were the people who would respond to Confederate monuments, who were the people who would respond to things that had in common with what white nationalist goals were, but were not quite there yet. And he would always call them the people who say, "I'm not a racist, but," and they would end it with, "I don't think there should be so many of those kind of people coming into town," or "I don't think that we should I think we should have more policing in that part of town because those kind of people live there." Like these sort of statements that are not so uncommon he considered the stepping stones. Like white nationalist recruiters considered them the stepping stones because they were a belief that showed some assumptions that were quite bad about what race means, about what other people mean in America. And the goal was to take that person and to commit them to a more extreme view, a more explicit view of what they were saying to begin with. And going back to what we said at the beginning, I think there's a litmus test that we can apply, that if what I'm saying or doing would be considered a stepping stone by a white nationalist, it is worth consulting why that would be the case. What is the impact on someone else, and what is the ultimate goal of this policy that I'm supporting?
This is a good point to bring Sara McCammon into the conversation. Sara, come join us on stage, if you will. Let me tell you just a little about Sara. She's a National Public Radio's national correspondent covering the Mid-Atlantic and Southeast. Her work focuses on political, social, and cultural divides in America, including the intersection of politics and religion. During the 2016 election cycle, she was NPR's lead political reporter assigned to the Donald Trump campaign. In that capacity, she was a regular on the NPR Politics podcast and reported on the Republican primary, the rise of Trump movement, divisions within the Republican Party over the future of the GOP, and the role of religion in those debates. That work earned her a rare invitation inside a closed-door meeting between evangelical leaders and Trump soon after he clinched the nomination. Sara, thanks for being with us this evening.
Thank you.
In Eli Saslow's book, and Derek has also reiterated this, it says there's mainstreaming of white nationalist language or racist language. You spent a lot of time with the Trump campaign in 2016, and we have often heard in response to rallies that there were comments that were racist comments made at those rallies. You've talked with a lot of folks from different backgrounds who are strong supporters of the president. How do his voters or his supporters view accusations of racism?
I want to say first that there are a lot of different kinds of Trump supporters. Some would say they voted for Trump reluctantly for a variety of reasons, but I'm going to talk primarily about enthusiastic Trump supporters here, the ones that showed up to rallies. And first of all, I never once, despite a lot of questions and a lot of discussions, I never once met anyone who would identify as a racist, would tell me they thought white people were superior. In fact, many of them would denounce racism and say that racism is a bad thing. They talk about having friends of color or living in communities alongside people of color and being fine with that. But they would express a lot of anxiety and concern about demographic change, cultural change around them. If I could, I want to go back to the summer of 2015. I was, right before I joined NPR to cover the campaign, I was a reporter at Georgia Public Broadcasting. And so the day that Trump announced, June 16th, 2015, came down those golden escalators at Trump Tower and said that immigrants coming to this country were not the best people, that Mexico was sending criminals and bringing drugs and sending rapists. That day, I wasn't paying much attention to Trump. In fact, that week was the same week, and I don't mean to draw a connection between these two events, but just to remind everyone of the chronology and where we were at that time, that was the same week of the Charleston shooting, which I covered. But as I got out on the campaign trail starting in July of that year, it wasn't white nationalists like Dylan Roof that the Trump voters I talked to were afraid of. They were afraid of people coming across the border, and they were afraid of this change that they were seeing in the country. I remember meeting a woman in Hilton Head, or near Hilton Head in July 2015, who told me that she just didn't feel safe to walk the streets anymore. And I asked her why not, and she said, she just didn't feel safe, just something felt funny to her. And I heard sentiments like that a lot. I pushed her on a little bit. Of course, data show that immigrants, including undocumented immigrants, actually commit crimes at a lower rate than native-born Americans. But most Trump supporters I talked to didn't accept that, didn't believe that data. And she was very concerned about what she saw as crime coming across the border. I remember then in February of 2016, when Trump won his first victory in the New Hampshire primary, talking to a man that night at the victory party, who told me, and it wasn't just violence people were worried about. This man told me that he really didn't like going to Panera and waiting in line and not being able to place an order, he said, because people were speaking Spanish. He said people in this country should be speaking English, and that was why he liked Trump. It was around that same time that David Duke endorsed Trump for president, and it took Trump several days to denounce him. And so around that time, I went to a rally in Huntsville, Alabama, and I spoke to a gentleman there who actually came up to the press pen. At Trump rallies, we were kept inside of a pen. We were not allowed to leave most of the time. So we'd have to hang the microphone over the side and talk to whoever would talk to us. And this man came up to me, and he approached me. He said, I want you to know that there's this idea out there that we're all racist and that we're uneducated. I have a master's degree in science. I work in a lab, and I'm a Trump supporter. And so I asked him about this David Duke thing and what was going on, and his words to me, and we had some discussions, we had a lot of discussions during that campaign about what was okay to put on the radio, what's amplifying a bad idea, and what is just accurately reporting what's actually happening. But we decided to use this clip because we thought it was illustrative. He told me he thought that black people were not sophisticated, that they'd been duped by the Democratic Party and taken in by the sort of liberal agenda, and that's why they weren't supporting Trump and they didn't understand how great Trump was. I could give a lot of other examples. Another one that sticks out in my mind is much closer to the election. I went to Washoe County, Nevada. This is where Reno is. It's a county that in the last 40 years has gone from about 1 in 20 Hispanics to about 1 in 4. And I met a couple that lived there for many years, and they articulated to me, again, this sense of my community is changing. I look around and I see people and I don't feel safe. And it was very clear they were talking about people of color. And you know, they described themselves as Christians. They were very devoted to each other and to their church. And I said, look, you know, this sounds really racist, what you're saying. Don't you understand how this comes across? And they said, you know, we're not racist. We've gone to church with Mexican people. We like to eat Mexican food. We just don't like the way things are changing around us. They also mentioned their sons, adult sons, you know, experiencing a lack of career opportunity, and they felt that their way of life was being threatened by people coming to this country and taking things in their words. But again, never did I meet anyone who said they were a racist. Never did I meet anyone who would acknowledge the racist ideas packed into the things that I just described. These people thought of themselves as defending their way of life, and they were very offended at the implication that Trump was a racist.
Derek's father's talked a little bit about white nationalists trying to recruit those same disaffected white supporters that Trump was going after. And you have interviewed many of those folks who are disaffected from the current political system. Can you talk a little bit about how the strategies of the white nationalists might be effective with those people? Based on your observations, would they be effective?
I just feel like I heard so many of the themes that Derek was talking about, and I think I touched on some of those. Again, this idea that white people were suffering, that white people didn't have the opportunities that other people did, that there's an us and a them, that these people who are different from us are coming in and taking our stuff and taking our opportunities and changing our culture. And I'm not really sure, I'm curious actually about how that works, how those ideas get sort of disseminated and absorbed, because it seems to me in growing up in white culture and also talking to a lot of white voters, that some of these ideas are just kind of in the ether. And I don't know how much it's white nationalists pushing them or how much they're just kind of baked into America. But white nationalists clearly are, amplifying them. But it seems, I'm not a historian, I'm not a sociologist, right? I'm just a journalist and I can tell you what I've seen and heard. But so many of these themes seem like they're just kind of there waiting, and I do think, there was a lot of debate around 2016 about, well, is it racism or is it economic change? And I think it's impossible to disentangle those two things. I think that one exacerbates the other. I think people are less generous and less kind when they're scared and when they're, when they're stressed. And I think that sometimes economic change can bring out the worst in people. It seemed to. People who in their own minds didn't want to be racist, but clearly had absorbed some racist ideas. But I'm not sure what the mechanism is, and I'm curious about that.
Derek, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I think that white nationalists don't see themselves as creating the situation, that it was always my experience that you find people where they are, and that was the assumption throughout a long time, where I think that the majority opinion was that we are post-racial. I remember in 2008, after Barack Obama's victory, there was so much discussion among the mainstream media that this election meant that therefore nobody would be organizing around whiteness or promoting white people. That we were beyond that, and that was not how white nationalists saw it, because they got more visits to their websites than they ever had before. They got more members, they got more donations, they got more people who were suddenly outraged. And so it was this bellwether of, not that they had created, but that they had taken to a more logical extreme and were trying to bring other people with them. And that's always how they see the world. It's not that they need to foster an othering idea. They need to foster a white community to feel like other people are a threat to them. They just need to find that where it exists and ramp it up.
And again, I'm not a historian, but I don't think you can overstate just the systemic racism that's baked into the history of this country. I mean, there's just sort of a lot of potential energy there. It seems like negative energy. There's such a long history of oppression of people of color that it's not as if all of a sudden white nationalists invented it.
I'd also want to comment that when you were describing people saying, I am absolutely not racist, I don't hate any other people, I am just concerned about change, that is what white nationalists say too, not just publicly but in private. It's what they believe about themselves. They would never say, I'm racist. It's a bad thing to be. It means you hate people. And they say, I don't hate people, I just don't want them to live near me. And they're able to say that with a straight face and believe that it doesn't mean that they're opposed to anyone.
I think in certain sectors there are people who would like to so narrowly define racism that it sort of inoculates them against that accusation. I remember talking to one Trump supporter who said, we've got to stop throwing this word around. It's just, yeah, racism used to be a problem, and yeah, it still is sometimes, but really, racism, that's lynching, and that's, racial epithets. That's not just, that's not what I am. And this narrow definition of what for him qualified as racism meant that so many other things got a free pass.
You've both talked a bit about sort of this trajectory into nationalism and white racism that reinforces the grievances of white grievance and victimhood. Let's go to the other direction for a minute. Derek, are there strategies or techniques that would loosen the grip of the white nationalist ideology on folks, or is there a point of no return?
It's difficult because there's no way to change people's minds about what they believe. No straightforward way to go out, and I think it's almost sort of arrogant to assume that I'm going to change someone's mind, like for any of us to say that person believes bad things and I'm going to convince them to believe good things. Like there's a level of arrogance that we should think about in ourselves when we approach that. But I think that if we're talking about inclusion, we're talking about not having policies that cause such harm to migrant communities, that cause such harm to black communities, thinking about trying to get to a place where people do not support those policies, I try to think about calling to attention how what you're supporting is harming someone, because I think this conversation, if nothing, is demonstrating that very few people in the world are willing to look at their own behavior and say, yes, that really harms people, but I don't care. There's very few people who would say that. They end up having to justify it. They end up having to say that's not true, or but they're a bad person, or they deserved it, or all these sort of things. And that's a conversation, once somebody is in that space, I think that's actually a conversation you can have that's quite productive. Trying to say, but this is having very bad outcomes for human beings, and you don't have to make that choice. And trying to have whoever you're talking to face that and say, okay, I don't want to cause harm to other people. Like that was something that was part of the conversations I had in college, and I think it's something that's fairly universal, and it's something that you can actually do if you're engaging with someone who is in good faith wanting to listen to you, and that you are also in good faith wanting to listen to them.
I want to ask a question about how the media deal with this, particularly when it's elected officials saying things that are racist. What is the media's role in holding presidents or members of Congress or state legislators and governors accountable if they make racist comments? What's NPR's policy on this? Is it shared by other organizations? Are there boundaries that you can't cross on that?
Our role is controversial, and it's an ongoing discussion, like I was saying, about whether or not to air that racist comment from the gentleman that I interviewed in Alabama. It's a difficult call, case by case, and again, you don't want to amplify or give a platform to extremist ideas, but when we're covering, a nominee for the President of the United States, we felt that it was not appropriate to sugarcoat what this was about, and that there were times when we needed to just sort of let people speak. That's a very tough call, and all I can really say about it is that we try to have thoughtful conversations about it. There's been a lot of debate about when to call something racist, and there's a diversity of opinion about when that's appropriate, and I know there are people who would like us to do it a lot more than we do. The reason, which you don't have to agree with, but I just want to explain, that we don't jump to that all that often is because, one, as journalists, we're supposed to stick to what we know and what we see, and some things are clearly racist, but sometimes we don't know someone's motives, we don't know what their thought process was. There is gray area, and to get on the wrong side of that and impugn someone's motives or to mislabel something, it doesn't always, it just sort of can reduce credibility with people that we would like to be listening and paying attention and maybe thinking. And so the question is, when do you alienate people and when do you actually just need to call a spade a spade? NPR did make the decision with the president's tweets a couple of months ago about the congresswomen when he said that they should go back to where they came from, to call that racist, because there's a really clear, long history of that kind of idea being used against people of color to marginalize them, to other them. And I think that was a good decision, but it was one that our head of diversity actually publicly said that he disagreed with. So it's not black and white, so to speak, how to make that call and when to say it. I think what's most important is that we don't back off from illuminating what's being said, and I hope that people will come to the right conclusions about it, will make their own decisions. It's tricky. I think I also think that in the Trump era, the media is in a really difficult space because there are a whole bunch of people that don't listen to us at all, and that mainstream media at least, and that don't think we have any credibility. And so, throwing around words like racist, it might make our most loyal, maybe liberal listeners happy, but I mean, those people already think Trump's a racist. I mean, I don't know. Our goal is to try to foster some dialogue, I think, and to be a platform for conversation. And so I think sometimes we as journalists have to stop short of maybe what we personally think and just sort of lay out little bits of data and let people connect the dots as they will.
This is a good opportunity, despite me having many more questions I could ask, to invite our students to come provide us with some questions from the audience. I don't know from where those students shall emerge. Hey, there they are. Looking good, guys. Emily, you want it first?
I'll start it off. So this was a hot question from the audience. So this is for Derek. After straying away from white nationalism, how has your relationship with your father and family been affected? And have you experienced backlash from white supremacists and nationalists?
Yeah, I broke away and condemned the movement by writing a letter, and I still feel quite bad that I did not warn him about it before. I just didn't know how to do it. And so he had some suspicions because I had stopped posting, because I had stopped doing the radio show, because I stopped being involved. But he found out that I was condemning the movement through this letter, and his first reaction was to say, "Oh, I think your email might have been hacked. How could that?" And I feel bad about it. Like, there were days afterwards where it was very dark. It was like calls where it was unclear whether we would ever be able to communicate, whether we would ever have connections again. And to his credit, I think there's some ability to communicate now. We're able to text and call every now and then, but it's always extremely tense. And to the second part, yes, it was outraged by the movement. I know there were threats for a while. There was widespread condemnation. There was, I guess, the sort of thing you would expect from, condemnation of this movement.
I have another one for Derek, and it says, to what extent has white nationalism corrupted and infiltrated American conservatism?
That is very interesting. I guess I would like to answer that, again, sort of by illustrating what the white nationalist perspective is. If you think back over the years, there's always been a fraught relationship between the white nationalist movement, whatever it looked like at different decades, and conservatism. And it was always quite antagonistic, usually quite antagonistic. They were very enthusiastic about the election of Ronald Reagan, but they became very disillusioned with him over years, particularly because of amnesty for undocumented workers. They supported, the first photo I showed, white nationalists supported Bush's election in 2000, but hated his administration. They hated the Iraq War. They hated his comprehensive immigration reform. They thought the Republican Party was their opponent, was their enemy. We always saw conservatism as a gatekeeper keeping us out. And I think in a lot of ways they are very surprised now to see those gates largely falling, that it's not a white nationalist party by any stretch, but the things that they pushed are now stronger within the conservative movement than they ever were in decades. They have more explicit advocacy from a Republican president for white nationalist talking points than any president has advocated in the modern era. And that's something that I think even leaves them reeling, to go from a period where it seemed like the Republican Party was their enemy to wondering whether it really has capitulated. Those are the conversations that take place among white nationalists now.
So this question is for both of you. The word racist is thrown around today even when race is not a concern. Do you think this downplays racism to something as simple as a disagreement? Does this affect the gravity of actual racism today?
I think I kind of touched on that with my answer about the media. I mean, I think we try to use the word carefully just because the risk, I think, of that. But I also think that, to me, the most important opinion about whether or not something is racist is the opinion of people of color. I mean, because they're the ones who are affected by it most directly. So I think in general, that's who white people need to defer to.
I think that makes sense, and I think it's also important to think about how there's no one in the world who calls themselves racist. White nationalists are openly white supremacist, and they say, oh, I'm not racist, how dare you call me racist? And like that's a reality that makes you wonder, what does this word mean? And it means, it's offensive to everyone. And so I think it's probably worth using. I think I try to use it, but I try to apply it to racist ideas or racist actions or a racist policy, because calling a person a racist seems to accomplish nothing, because no one identifies by it, nobody says that's accurate, and nobody who you're applying it to is willing to listen to you. But I do think saying what you are advocating is a racist idea, like that's a space where the person could maybe address it a little bit more and say, what's the impact of my idea? What's the impact of this policy that's racist? And then I could say, well, let me talk about it.
I also think people need to be less afraid of acknowledging that we're all shaped by a racist system. And I mean, I think it's such a taboo that to say that, oh, I too have grown up in a racist culture and have to evaluate the ways that shape me. I think that's a conversation we all need to have. I sometimes give this example with sexism. I remember in my early years as a reporter, getting on the phone to talk to an expert that I'd lined up through a PR person, and it was Dr. So-and-so, and I get on the phone and I hear a female voice. And I had this really quick instinctive moment where I was like, and I realized, part of me thinks she's not as credible or authoritative because she's a woman, and I'm a woman. And if I can be shaped by sexism to that degree, as a woman, as a feminist, as a working mom who's always worked, and as someone who would yell at you if you told me that I was any less capable, if I can be shaped by that, I think we all have to realize how we can be shaped by the systems in which we're raised. And our job is it's better to deny that, I think, is actually really dangerous. And it's important to try to unpack that and be aware of it, not deny it.
I have another one for both of you. It says, do you believe that the recent rise of white nationalism is a result of Trump's presidency and rhetoric, or a buildup of tension and backlash after having a black president?
Both. It's
Nice diplomatic answer there.
white nationalists were energized by the election of Barack Obama because they were energized by the election of Barack Obama. And in the same way, I think there are large swaths of American white people who also felt like they were losing something and reacted in a, what I think we should say, racist way to the idea of not having a white president. And I think the way white nationalists reacted and the way lots of people actually did react, even if they would always deny it, unlike white nationalists were the only group who would say it's because the person's black. And then most people would say it's big government or it's socialism or it's something, but it's reasonable for there to be racial reactions like that in America. We have a long history of white domination. We have a long history of racial unrest. And for the first black president to not cause a lot of white people to suddenly clinch and feel like something had changed, I think that would have been very unexpected. And I think the reactions that both of them have had were coming from the same place, and I think white nationalists took advantage of that in the same way that I think Donald Trump took advantage of that. He seems to believe the things he says, of course, but he also recognized a tide that he could ride, and white nationalists did the same thing.
I mean, Trump was one of the architects of the birther movement, so I mean, that says a lot. Again, just speaking to what I observed on the campaign trail, I met a lot of Trump supporters who were, really, and it's hard to separate what's political feelings, and people are allowed to have their political beliefs, of course, but, I met a lot of really visceral dislike for Obama, and, you can decide what that was about.
So this is for Derek, and it was asked by Chris Corey. Based on your student experience, what advice would you give a college administrator or administration in how to deal with white nationalism on campus?
I think that's also difficult, especially considering my experience in large part did not involve administration. That I recognize we are now on the campus of a liberal arts college, and there are probably administrators in this room, and so think about this. I once went to a university and I had a dean ask me, oh, this turned out really well, like what did the dean there do? And I said nothing, and she was just aghast. And I don't mean this to call out New College, because I think it's a very difficult situation. It wasn't an option to expel me. I was a good student who did well academically. I wasn't threatening anyone. I wasn't making anyone feel like physically intimidated. And so what exactly they could do, I recognize as a public institution, what could they do? Like, that's actually a real question. And what actually happened was the campus acting, the campus forcing the hand of the administration to allow them to have a day of teaching. It was the campus that activated all of this protest and condemnation. It was members of the campus who reached out to me. And I think administrators probably have more of a role than nothing, but it ultimately falls to the entire community, that administrators can't fix a problem. It's your peers, it's your teachers, it's all the people around you, and how we all respond to something. That you can't just, in the same way that you can't look to the mayor to solve all the problems in a city, you can't look to the administrators to solve all the problems in a campus.
And if I'm sitting here right in the sight line of the provost, and if I am reading his expression correctly, it is, yes, students, by all means, take responsibility. I think he would be fine with that. All right, I've lost track of which direction
This
I'm
one
going here.
is for both of you as well, and it's from a student named Catherine. And she asks, how do women and women's rights fit into the ideology of the white nationalist movement?
In large part, it's a misogynistic movement because it believes that women shouldn't be in leadership roles, and that women's role is to have families, and it's like classically misogynistic. There are aspects that are strangely feminist. Like, there are moments where a group will make sure to have a woman as the spokesperson, or to talk about how women should be in leadership roles more broadly. And in those moments, I think there's strange moments of almost pseudo-feminism empowerment, but for the most part, this is a movement that does not value women's input into actions. And so the role that women play is essential, but it's typically not on the front lines. It's like keeping the mailing list and making sure all the mailings go out and making sure the donations are filed, and in some cases, literally sewing the Klan robes. This is like... So it's essential to the running of the white nationalist movement, but it's typically not out front.
I want to follow up on that a minute with Sara. In your observations on the campaign trail and other stories that you've done, are women as vocal in their views on this as the men have been?
Yeah, I mean, 53, 51%, I think, of white women voted for Trump. And many of the people I'm thinking of, when I mentioned sort of visceral dislike for Obama, what I mean is things like sort of without, again, and I think you have to leave space for the fact that many people just disagreed with Obama's policies, and that's a different issue. But the woman I met in Nevada said, just these last 8 years, they've just been so dark. They've just been so terrible, and it seemed like it felt like there was something else going on there, and given the context of everything else she said about people of color, I think you could connect those dots potentially. In South Carolina, at Hilton Head, the woman who told me that she didn't feel safe walking around anymore, that was a woman. I heard women saying these things, I think just as much as the men, and yeah, I don't know what that says. I mean, I think there's a long history there surrounding white women and racial issues that would take a historian to unpack.
I want to thank our students. I want to thank you folks for asking questions, and I want to end with one question that I hope will send us out on a very positive note. Derek, your story is one of hope. If you can change your views, surely others can change their views as well. How can those of us here tonight awaken people to the dangers of radical right-wing ideology and white supremacist views? How do we talk to people who aren't here tonight, who may not have put in a lot of thought on these issues?
I think I would address it with how I ended that talk, that the only thing that I really can try to leave anyone with is that individual action really has an impact, that I'm not sure there's anything that is more important than individual relationships and the ones that we all have with the people around us. It's certainly what happened to me, but I think if you look at persuasion broadly, among everyone who has ever been persuaded, it doesn't happen because you encountered an encyclopedia entry. It happens because you know somebody who you talk to who brings you along, and so that's the role that we have to play. If you really think that there are things that are wrong with our society, your obligation is to then try to do something, and often that takes the form of talking to people. Sometimes it takes the form of organization, sometimes it takes the form of protest, but all of those are, when they boil down, your personal reactions, your interactions.
Sarah, do you want to add to that?
I try not to give too much advice as a journalist, but I do think these kinds of forums and conversations are important. And I hope that people are talking to each other. You know, the reason I mentioned at the beginning that I was talking about a certain subset of Trump supporters is that I think that there are, many Trump voters who are concerned. I know them personally about racial issues and, voted for Trump reluctantly. And I don't intend to imply that everyone who voted for Trump is the same. And certainly in a place like South Carolina, I'm sure there's probably a diversity of opinion in this crowd and certainly among your friends and neighbors. And so I hope that people keep talking and keep, when I talked about self-examination, I think that's really important for all of us to sort of have a certain amount of humility about what we think and what we do and what we know. And so I think it's good that we're here and that we're talking, and I hope we all keep talking to each other.
I would echo that. Keep the conversations going. I have been alerted that our time is up. I want to remind you there are books for sale at the back if you want to continue reading more about the subject. Thank you, audience, for your participation tonight. I want to thank the Riley Institute and Ollie for their support and sponsorship of the program, to Jill Fuson particularly for all of her hard work in coordinating this. Thank you to our speakers, and for those of you who like to plan ahead, next year, the first 3 Tuesday evenings in September, we're going to have Straight Talk 2020 on voting in America. Thank you for coming.